Well, thanks very much, William, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along tonight. Well, we have a confronting topic tonight, because war is never a pleasant thing to think about. But as Christadelphians, we believe that the book we just read from, the Bible, is a practical book. It not only gives us direction about how to live our life, on how God wants us to live our life, God has also given us a glimpse into the future, to understand the things that are happening around us. He's given us prophecy, incredible prophecies, such as the one we just read from Joel 3. And God's given us these things that we might make sense not only of the past, but we might know about current events. We might know where this world is headed. We want to make sense of these things, and God wants us to make sense of these things, because God is in control of this earth. God has an ultimate plan and purpose for this earth. His angels, at this very moment, are actively working to bring about his purpose. Now, we want to consider the text that William just read for us tonight. And if you followed along there as he read, and contemplated some of those things that Joel 3 spoke about, can you think of any other religious book or any other man-made book that gives a prophecy like the Bible does? And the chapter we just read of in Joel deals with what are called end-time prophecies, and that's really what we've been dealing with, as we referred to, from Daniel to Ezekiel 38, and tonight from Joel chapter 3. These prophecies deal with what will happen at the end of the world as we know it, at the end of this age, at the end of man having control over what he believes is his destiny. And these end-time prophecies give us an understanding into the signs that we need to look for, that herald the coming of his Son back to this earth. Because as we said, God is in control of the happenings of this earth and has been since the creation, 6,000 years ago. Now, we believe in the literal time periods that the Bible gives. And you can map out 6,000 years since creation, with 2,000 years from creation to the flood, and then 2,000 years from the flood until Christ, and another 2,000 years from Christ until our time. And it is this last period of time, that last 2,000 years, that is evidenced by the fact that we live in the year 2024. 2,000 years since Christ was on this earth, or 2024 AD, or after death. We are right on the cusp of the 7th millennium. And according to the timetable that God has laid out in the Bible, that last 1,000 years that the Bible ascribes to the kingdom age, an age that is very briefly described at the end of Joel chapter 3 here, verse 20 and 21, where Joel says, "But Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will cleanse their blood that I have not cleansed. For Yahweh dwelleth in Zion." But we want to look at the other events that take place between now and the establishment of this world. The kingdom that God will set up on this earth, and Christ will rule as king. Those times, as we said, before that happens, are described as the end time. Now, in the lecture last week, Mr. Jerome Steele looked at Ezekiel 38. And feel free to go and watch that lecture on YouTube if you haven't, because it ties in very nicely to our lecture tonight. And if you want to just turn back there briefly, Ezekiel 38, verse 8. I'll put that. Hang on. Click through that. So Ezekiel 38 verse 8 where Ezekiel says that after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. So we know that Ezekiel 38 deals with the end time prophecies because it says in the latter years. And that's a key phrase that comes up again and again to show that these are the times just before Christ returns. So it shall be in the latter years that shall come into a land when it is brought back from the sword. And Jerome would have showed that that land that is brought back from the sword is the land of Israel. And the land of Israel and the people in that land have been gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought back forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. We saw last week that these people that are brought back from the sword, that are gathered out of many nations upon the mountains of Israel, are the Jews. And it says, as we said, this happens in the latter years. Now, subject tonight goes into more detail of that battle described in Ezekiel 38 and helps us to understand some of the motivation that these nations that form this confederacy and come into Israel, some of the motivation they have to come against Israel. If we go back to Joel now, chapter 3, verse 1, says, "For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem." Now, where it says in those days, it's referring back to chapter 2 of Joel. And if we get some context from maybe verse 31 of Joel chapter 2, it says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." So we know here that we're dealing with the same time period, just before the Lord comes. In those days. These are the latter days. The latter days where the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem will be returned. Now, we know that this sign, the return of the Jews, is an incredible sign. It's one of the most incredible things, I guess, that has happened to a nation state, that they have been completely removed out of their land and brought back again. It's a sign that's recent. No one can deny it's happened. No one can say that it's not a miracle that they currently survive today. It's one of those signs that are irrefutable. And the Bible again and again and again repeats that this will be a sign that these things that we read of in Ezekiel 38 and Joel 3 here are about to happen. Now, just to give some context to the Jews' return to the land, because this is important context to why these nations come against Israel. And these are, I guess, the emotions that the world is currently going through. Because if you look at the map on the left there, that is the petition, or the initial petition plan for Israel before it was voted on in 1948. Now, the region that was supposed to be given to Israel, as you can see there, is in light blue. The yellow is the proposed Arab state, and the red is the international administered Sanctum of Jerusalem. Now we know, or you might know, the history of 1948. As soon as the nation was declared, all of Israel's enemies declared war on it. Now, we know that in the lead up to the creation of Israel, 1948 is only 3 years since the end of World War II, where 6 million Jews had been exterminated by the Nazis. There were persecution in many countries throughout Europe, including obviously Germany, places like Russia, and this caused many Jews to seek refuge, and they came into the nation of Israel, which before it was formed, they bought parcels of land, they established kibbutzes, they made it their home, and then that was legalized in 1948. So as soon as their nation was proclaimed, they found themselves in war on day one. And this war became the War of Independence. And Israel seemingly had zero chance. They were surrounded on all sides by enemies. So on May 14, 1948, that day, there followed an immediate invasion by Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, leading to the first Arab-Israeli war. And then 1 year after that, there was an armistice signed. Israel had managed to fend off all those nations, but not only fend them off, they actually gained masses of territory. You can see that light purple is all the territory they gained. So they didn't lose any territory. They weren't pushed into the sea, which is what the Arabs were predicting or hoping. They actually increased their territory. Now, we are skipping over a lot of history here, but these are some major events that have happened in Israel's history. Another 19 years later, the Arab nations again of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria began preparing for another invasion of Israel in 1967. And Israel preempted that war by striking particularly Egyptian airfields and taking out their air force, and in other parts in the Sinai Peninsula, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in the Golan Heights, they further increased their territory. And in 1967, they also gained more than what they probably were hoping. They gained access to Jerusalem. Now, it's important to remember here that Israel was not the aggressor. These nations, again, were trying to drive Israel into the sea. And just before the war, Israel actually sent messages to King Hussein of Jordan to stay out of the conflict. And Jordan, directly going against that, opened fire on West Jerusalem, which led to a response by the Israeli forces to take over parts of Jerusalem, and then finally the whole city, of a direct assault on the old city of Jerusalem. And they captured what's called Ammunition Hill, a key defensive position, and the paratroopers again infiltrated into the old city and took over the Temple Mount. And it was the Israeli 55th Paratrooper Brigade under Colonel Motagur who entered the old city through the Lion's Gate at 10 a.m. and they secured the western wall in the Temple Mount area. And that picture at the bottom right there is a picture of 3 of those paratroopers as they, still under fire, were so emotional that they couldn't help but stand by that western wall and pray. And that is the western wall that is still used today, that the Jews pray at, the base of the Temple Mount, the western wall. So, as a result of 1967, Israel annexed East Jerusalem, and they declared it their undivided capital. And this was done through the application of their law, through administration of the area, and to this day, that jurisdiction that Israel assumes of Jerusalem is not recognized internationally. And I put it to you, that is one of the main reasons that Israel still today is one of the most maligned nations by the UN governing body. These wars all obviously caused significant displacement of Palestinians as well, as when they fled their homes, the countries that they fled into didn't provide housing for them. They usually go into refugee camps. And many of the Arabs that lived in Jerusalem as well were transported into Jordan and still to this day live in refugee camps in Jordan. And for the Jews, the capture of Jerusalem has led to many problems, such as clashes over the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, which for the Jews had been inaccessible since 1948. And they saw it as a major victory, obviously, but the Palestinians and the Muslims losing East Jerusalem has led to profound loss for them, politically and spiritually, as Israel now controls the area. The sentiment towards the Jews has obviously changed as well since 1948, where most of the nations wanted to find a homeland for the Jews. The Israelites have continued to build settlements in areas that are not sanctioned by the international community, and that includes the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority still controls, inverted commas, most of that area, but Israel has continued building settlements in that area. Israel also extended its laws into East Jerusalem, giving the residents of that place the choice of Israeli citizenship, but most declined that and opted for Jordanian citizenship. So a lot of those people that they govern in that area are still not Israelis. And obviously, Jerusalem remains one of the key issues for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, Jerusalem has been the centre of world attention for many millennia. It's often been fought over, captured and recaptured by many different peoples and empires. But God prophesied here in Joel chapter 3 verse 1 that Jerusalem would be under Jewish control. God's made it clear that despite all of the toing and froing and all the battles that have been fought in this city belongs to him. And he plans to restore it to the true people of that city. These people that have been called out of many nations. Now, if you just come across with me to Zechariah chapter 2, because I feel this also helps to give us a lot of context to Joel chapter 3. No, we haven't dealt a lot with Joel chapter 3 yet. I just want to read through Zechariah chapter 2 here, because this here is God's feelings of this city. This is why God cares so much for this city. This is why this city and its possession now and into the future is under God's control, not man's. So, verse 1, I lifted up my eyes again, and this is Zechariah speaking, and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. And he said, Whither goest thou? And I said, Whither goest thou? And he said to me, To measure Jerusalem, to see what the breadth thereof and the length thereof. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him. And he said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as the towns without walls, for the multitude of men and women and cattle therein. For I, saith Yahweh, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith Yahweh. For I have spread you forth as the four winds of the heavens, saith Yahweh. Using the same language here. These were the Jews that were spread throughout the world. Deliver thyself, O Zion, thou that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. For thus saith Yahweh of armies, After the glory has sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that touched you toucheth the apple of his eye. For behold, I will shake my hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to their servants. And ye shall know that Yahweh of armies hath sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for lo, I come, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, saith Yahweh. And many nations shall be joined to Yahweh in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of thee. And thou shalt know that Yahweh of armies hath sent me unto thee. And Yahweh shall inherit Judah his portion in the Holy Land, and shall choose Jerusalem again. Be silent, O all flesh, before Yahweh. for he is raised up out of his holy habitation. That's how God feels about this city and about this land and about this people. God will bring these things to pass, no matter what man thinks, no matter if Jerusalem is internationally recognized or not. God has caused Israel to possess it and will cause them to possess it in the future. For the Jews, this is their ancient capital. Jerusalem, for the Jews, is considered their holiest city. It's where the first and second temples stood on the Temple Mount. It's been a focal point of worship for the Jewish nation for centuries. And the Western Wall is the most sacred place for Jews today, a remnant of that second temple. And it's the only place that Jews have to go to consider the time when God was with them. Of course, Jerusalem is central to Jewish history, to culture, to identity. All Jewish prayers are directed towards it. And their hope in returning is expressed by the phrase often repeated around the world, next year in Jerusalem. It's often said during the Passover. Now, there are obviously other religious faiths that claim possession of Jerusalem. Christianity also claim this city as their own. For Christians, Jerusalem is sacred because of its connection to the life of Christ. Key events, obviously, in Christ's life took place there. His crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection. The church also has many holy sites in Israel and in Jerusalem itself, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Hill of Crucifixion and Jesus' tomb. And Jerusalem was obviously where Pentecost also occurred. But that's not all. Islam also claim Jerusalem as one of their holy sites. And the believers in Islam call Jerusalem Al-Quds. And Al-Quds is the third holiest city after Mecca and Medina. It's the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the top of the Dome of the Rock, located on the Temple Mount. The Quran also references Jerusalem, though not by name. And Islamic tradition holds that Muhammad was transported from Mecca to Jerusalem through the night journey of Isra, where he ascended to heaven from the site of the Dome of the Rock. So Jerusalem is a much sought after city, not only just as a geographical location, but especially for its spiritual significance. And you can see why this war that we've mentioned, Ezekiel 38 and Joel 3, is a religious war. And it's a war particularly over this city. Whose God is the strongest? Whose spiritual understanding of the Bible, of the Quran, of the prophets of old is true? So this is a religious war that we're talking about. The sacredness of this city has made it a focal point for pilgrimages for all of these three faiths. And is the world happy that the Jews, who are mostly secular, although a lot of them are religious, are they happy that the Jews are in control of Jerusalem? You can say an emphatic no to that, because even today most national embassies are not located in Israel's chosen capital city. Even Australia's embassy is still not in Jerusalem, it's in Tel Aviv. I think America moved their embassy there during the Trump administration 8 years ago. Or about 6 years ago, I think it was. And it can be seen also by the number of UN resolutions condemning Israel. And to this day, I think there's about 50 or so resolutions condemning Israel for their complete and united capital stance, which they made in 1980. However, as we've seen, the return of the Jews to their homeland is a key biblical prophecy. And if you come to Jeremiah chapter 16 for a second. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 14. Says, therefore behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that shall no more be said that Yahweh liveth that brought the children of Israel up out of the land of Egypt. He that liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and from all lands from whither he had driven them. But I will bring them again into their land that I gave to their fathers. And behold, I send fishers, saith Yahweh, and they shall fish them. And other will I send many hunters, and they shall hunt for them from every mountain and from every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks. This is what God had to do to bring the children of Israel back into this land, to pass these prophecies. God made this happen. God has caused the conflict over this place, so that the world might know that he is God. Come across now to a chapter we're going to deal with next week in next week's lecture, but we're just going to briefly look at it now as well. Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah's battles will take place. And we see verse 2, that God will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And that city is going to be rifled. The Jews are going to be killed and scattered. And it says, verse 3, that God would go against those nations. God is going to come and judge those nations that come against Israel. And at that time, verse 4, his feet, the feet of Christ, will stand upon the Mount of Olives. And that's fulfillment of a prophecy that was given as Jesus went into heaven in Acts chapter 1 verse 11. And the angels made that prophecy as the disciples stood there looking at Jesus as he ascended into heaven. The angels made a prophecy that he would come in the like manner. And we see that being fulfilled here in verse 4, that Christ will once again return and he's going to land on the Mount of Olives. And when he lands on the Mount of Olives, that mountain's going to split in two. And it's going to cause an earthquake that's going to reverberate around the world. And it's going to change the topography of that land. And we're not going to read through this because it's going to be dealt with next week. But this whole land's going to be changed. In verse 8, it says that living waters would go out of Jerusalem. So the land is going to change. The waters are going to flow in different directions. And if you come down to verse 21, this place, Jerusalem, that we've talked about, that's going to be the subject of another battle, another religious battle. It says that after Christ comes and wipes out all these nations, yea, it says, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto Yahweh of armies, and all they that sacrifice shall come and take them, and see therein. And in that day there shall no more be Canaanite in the house of Yahweh of armies. So this future that we just very briefly touched on in Zechariah 14, and we're going to come back to in a second in Joel, allude to, have strong religious connections that Christ is going to resolve. It's going to be without a doubt whose city this is. And what religion is the true religion? There'll be no more a Canaanite in the house of Yahweh, it says in verse 21 there. These problems are going to be solved. And as Christadelphians, we're not the only ones who believe that these events are about to happen on this earth. In fact, we're just going to consider briefly what the Catholics believe these events that are described here, what they believe is actually going to happen during this time. Now, I'm going to play you the opening scene of a movie, and that movie is called Left Behind, and it's actually a movie based on a series of books called the Left Behind series. I'm not sure if any of you have looked at that. But this scene that we're going to look at, we have a formula that allows the soil to be fertile, and you can grow corn in the middle of a desert. And this formula could potentially end world hunger, to reduce conflicts over resources and significantly impact global economics and politics. And Buck mentions in this report that many nations would be interested in this formula, and it could shift global power dynamics. And the underlying idea is that Israel and Israeli has developed this way to solve world hunger and to bring world peace. And his concern is that others might want this sort of control over the world. And he is skeptical that the world is going to come to peace because of this. All right, now I showed you that because I think it's important to realise that a lot of the world, and this, as I said, is a Catholic-produced production, a lot of the world believes that these things are about to happen. They believe that Israel is going to be invaded, and as we see at the end there, they're going to be delivered by a figure. And that figure, they believe, is the Antichrist. And this invasion of Israel and this deliverance of Israel begins a period of what they believe is the 7 years of tribulation. And during these 7 years of tribulation, the Catholic faith believe that they're going to be tested, because this Christ is going to set himself up in Jerusalem as a king over the whole earth. He's going to bring world peace, he's going to bring prosperity, but it's their job to resist him. And there's 3 series of movies that go on to show how the Catholics really need to dig down into the deep roots of their faith to not go along with what this Antichrist does. And at the end of that 7 years of tribulation, they need to stand up and rise up against him and overthrow him. And the overthrow of the Antichrist will bring the kingdom, the Catholics believe. Now, we haven't got time to go full into that tonight, but these are a list of all the similarities between what we believe Christ will do and what they believe the Antichrist will do. And if you're interested, I can't remember the actual title of the book, but Jason Hensley has written a book basically going through all of this, what the Catholics believe the Antichrist will do and what we believe Christ will do. And it's interesting to our topic tonight, because really the fight over Israel and Jerusalem is a religious war. The doctrine that you believe has an impact on what you do in your life. If you're a Catholic and you see the Antichrist doing these things, you need to stand up and resist him. If you see a Russian invasion of Israel, if you see that invasion being destroyed by a world figure that will stand up as Christ, you need to resist him. And there are many, many similarities. You're supposed to think they're reading the same Bible and yet coming to a completely different conclusion. And it's frightening, I guess, to consider that we can read the same thing and yet come to a completely different conclusion. It is it's scary, and I guess it shows what needs to happen to this world for them to be shaken out of their misunderstanding. This sort of conflict does need to happen because people are not going to change their minds otherwise. All right, let's come back to Joel chapter 3 for a second. I know we haven't dealt a lot with it tonight, but these things that we read of in Joel are similar, I guess, to what we've read in Ezekiel 38 and what we're going to look at next week in Zechariah chapter 14. Verse 17 says there, "So shall you know that I am Yahweh, that I, Yahweh your God, dwelleth in Zion, my holy mountain. Then shall Jerusalem be holy, and there shall no strangers pass through her any more." And verse 18, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the mountain which shall drop down new wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters, and a fountain shall come forth of the house of Yahweh, and shall water the valley of Shittim. Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness, for the violence against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah, as we read before, shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem shall be from generation to generation. I will cleanse their blood that I have not cleansed, for Yahweh dwelleth in Zion." Now these things, as we've said, we believe that Christ will do. He will bring to the world a worldwide government from Jerusalem. He will bring the desolation that will be caused by these events, these wars against Israel, where he will bring all nations, as it says, into the valleys of Jehoshaphat, where men will beat their plowshares into swords and their pruning hooks into spears. All the nations of the world will assemble themselves, and God will send Christ to awaken the world to what is truly going to be an eye-opening experience for the world. They will see that this Bible they've had in front of them for so long has been true. As it says, he will bring them into the valley of decision, a valley where all men will have to make a decision. Are they going to serve this new king? Are they going to serve the Christ? Or are they going to believe what the Catholics tell them and resist him? For God, it says, will roar against them. He will roar out of Zion. He will utter his voice from Jerusalem. And the heavens and the earth shall shake. But Yahweh will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. There's no ambiguity here. We have to choose what side we're going to be on. This is the hope that the Bible gives. This is a vision of the topography of the land changed, of the world again cleansed of the human element, the human understanding of these things. But God will make it plain what the truth of the Bible is. And this is a true hope. It gives hope of a temple established on the ashes of Jerusalem that had been leveled by the earthquake as Christ touched his feet on the Mount of Olives. The earthquake that will begin the destruction of the nations that have come to destroy the Jewish people because of the false doctrine that has caused them to oppose Christ. And Christ will build a new Jerusalem on the slopes of the hill of Zion. And as we've read, the rivers of living water will flow from under the altar, and they'll flow to the east and to the west, towards the former sea and towards the hinder sea, as it says in Zechariah 14. And Yahweh shall be king over all the earth. And on that day there will be one Lord, and his name one. And all the land shall be turned from Gibeah to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, and it shall be lifted up in her place, from Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, unto the corner gate, unto the tower of Hananiel, unto the king's wine presses. It's specific here. And the last verse of Zechariah 14 will end on. Looking at that picture there as a vision of our hope, a vision of the end of these wars. And war, of course, as we started tonight, is never nice. We don't rejoice in the destruction of people. And God gives us opportunity now, and he gives these people in the future, not too distant future, that he gives them opportunity to change their ways and to repent and to serve his Son. But in the end, God will have his way. And to this temple here, all men shall dwell in it, and there will be no more destruction. But friends, we pray this will be soon. For the first time, maybe in many, many millennia, Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.